He's our modern Euro specialist.
Oh, great. Nice to meet you. If you came from Chapel Hill, you should have given me a ride.
I came this morning. This morning,
Your mother-in-law lives in Chapel Hill?
her late husband was back in the pediatrician. Some of the different medical boards are up there. So they sent me on the left.
Where they live?
She lives at Carroll Woods.
Oh,
Retirement
sure.
complex.
Yeah, okay.
I enjoy going up there.
Yeah. But that drive back is,
Well, 5 years ago, part of why they're part of the speed. So it's I don't care anymore.
so do you come down to Columbia and then over?
Now we do because 85 is work. Normally we take the 85 because it makes us get to Athens and we take the rest and up here.
Oh, okay. Well, I thought of driving, but I thought it would just, all things considered, just the wear and tear.
Yeah, you wouldn't feel rested once you go.
And because driving home, I got to teach on Thursday, so
Anyway,
yeah.
glad you're here.
Well, thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm David Davis, Associate Director of the Spencer B. King Jr. Center for Southern Studies, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the second lecture in this year's Lamar Lecture Series. The King Center at Mercer University is an NEH-funded institute that fosters conversations about the U.S. South that are open, honest, and accessible. For more than 60 years, Mercer has hosted the Lamar Lectures, the nation's premier series of lectures on Southern history, literature, and culture. The lecturer for this year is Dr. Fitz Brundage, William Umstead Distinguished Professor of History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. One of the nation's most prominent historians of the U.S. South and human rights, he has written important works on the history of lynching, utopian socialism in the New South, and white and black historical memory in the South. His most recent book, Civilizing Torture, documents the history of torture in the United States from the time of European contact to the 21st century. His Lamar lectures, The Prisoner of War Experience in the American Civil War, focus on the history of combatant incarceration during the Civil War. In his opening lecture this morning, he explained that Civil War prisoner of war camps were a modern intervention in custodial incarceration. For combatant states, prisoners of war have always presented a challenge, and historically, they were usually either killed, held for ransom, or exchanged for other prisoners. During the Civil War, the Union and the Confederacy followed a policy of parole and exchange until 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. Facing the prospect of fighting African Americans in uniform, the Confederacy ended the process of prisoner exchange, and the Union reciprocated, leading to the emergence of networks of facilities for mass incarceration. Dr. Brundage's lecture tonight, which he warns is grim, is titled Living an Enclosed Life, Prisoners of War in Place. After tonight's lecture, We will have some time for conversation, and we invite you to join us for the final lecture tomorrow here at 6 p.m. Please help me welcome Dr. Brundage.
Well, thank you for that generous introduction, and thank all of you for coming. As I said this morning, it's a tremendous honor and privilege to participate in this very distinguished lecture series. I'm going to open up with just a general observation before getting into the meat of what I'm talking about tonight, and acknowledge that this morning I was talking about the process of the dehumanization of prisoners of war in very general terms. And I was outlining the broad contours this morning. But this evening and then tomorrow, I'm going to focus as much on individuals as I will on the broad outlines. And that's because, as I suggested this morning, the experience of being a prisoner of war was so novel, so unprecedented in the lives of the individual men, and actually unprecedented in a certainly American experience, that even though they shared the experience of captivity with other prisoners, they devoted a lot of mental time, a lot of mental energy, with great intensity to trying to understand the experience as they were undergoing it and then later. And that the thoughtfulness with which they thought, reflected on the experience, is often poignant and I think quite heartrending. They struggled to find the appropriate words to describe this experience because they didn't have it previously, they didn't know what to compare it to. And they struggled to find ways, sometimes using stilted prose in their memoirs, in their letters, in their diaries, sometimes very florid prose. And they also made hurried and amateurish sketches with their prison pens, which I'll show you some of those. And then there are the silences in what they wrote. And their silences are sometimes achingly eloquent. So we should, I suggest, begin and end with their stories. And I also think we should do this with a sense of humility informed by the own lapses of our age when we listen to their stories. And so this history can be told many ways. I've elected to place the experience of individuals at the center of this history. In part, or in large measure, because I do so out of respect to the individual humanity of the people whose history I'm explaining or trying to explain. So tonight we're going to be talking about boundaries, the boundaries that define the lives of prisoners of war. So you know, tonight's comparatively grim. It's not like tomorrow will be that much sunnier, but it will be slightly sunnier. And we'll be talking about prisoners of war in motion. It's a different experience than what we're talking about tonight. A keen sense, a keen grasp of boundaries was seldom acknowledged, but it was an essential competence for any Civil War prisoner. Inattention to boundaries or intentional violation of them could be risky, even deadly. Whatever the setting, spatial awareness improved a prisoner's prospects of surviving captivity. When we think of modern prisoner of war camps, we probably think of barbed wire. It's one of the defining features of prisoner of war camps from the Boer War on. As you may know, barbed wire was invented after the Civil War, so they didn't have it. They would have used it, I'm sure. So they didn't have this, so they had to come up, that is, the Civil War generation had to come up with other ways of establishing boundaries. Well, at Libby Prison in Richmond, prison that I'll refer to many times, prisoners made a life or death calculation about how close they got to windows like this. Libby Prison doesn't exist anymore, but we actually have that window. They were covered, as you can see, by these cross-hatched bars. They were open to the elements. There was no covering for the windows. There were no shutters or anything. So Union prisoners could taunt citizens of Richmond by yelling out the window, which they did. They could sing patriotic songs out the windows. And if they were so inclined, they could stick their arms out, and so you could imagine almost touching freedom beyond the walls of the prison. But if they did so, they risked a fairly good likelihood of being shot down by the Confederate sentinels on the outside of the prison. And there were, I could give you the numbers of how many were actually shot for doing those various activities I described. Well, it was a different experience at Camp Douglas in Chicago, or Camp Randall in Madison, Wisconsin. It probably doesn't look like it here. This is Camp Douglas, which is on the south side of Chicago today, and is roughly where the University of Chicago, well, a little north of where the University of Chicago is, or near where, if this means something to you, where the Obama Presidential Library would be. In any case, that fence doesn't look as rickety as it was. So these were very weak exoskeletons for these prisons. It was only the lethargy of prisoners at Camp Randall in Madison, Wisconsin that kept them from escaping. The fencing at Camp Douglas here was so inadequate that prisoners routinely scaled it and ran off and escaped, and civilians routinely conversed with prisoners through it, at least in the early parts of the war. Other boundaries of these prison pens were not so flimsy. At Andersonville, the stockade was an imposing 15-foot high stockade, which you can see in the far background. You may be able to make it out through the haze, and it's down there at the bottom edge of the picture. But take my word for it, it's a 15-foot high stockade that demarcated the 26 acres that constituted the known world of prisoners there. But it was a so-called deadline, from which we get the term deadline, but that's another story. But it was a so-called deadline that was the most conspicuous manifestation of Confederate authority. And it was actually the deadline that circumscribed the lives of prisoners. And we can see the deadline in this picture taken in August of 1864. You'll notice, I'll point it out to you here. It looks like a sort of hitching post fence. That's the deadline. Stakes were driven into the ground with pieces of scantling nailed on top. And this primitive fence snaked parallel to the stockade fence, about 15 feet inside of it, all the way around the interior of the camp. So when we say 26 acres, then you've got to take off the portion of land that's in between the deadline and the stockade fence. Anyone who ventured too close to the deadline risked being shot by sentries. But if you notice that photograph, you'll see the crowding in Andersonville was so severe that you'll notice these prisoners' hovels, whatever you want to call them, are built against the deadline. So if they rolled out of bed, in air quotes, the wrong way, it could have consequences. Their apparent cavalier disregard for the dangers of the deadline was a calculated risk in an environment where habitable space was as dear as life itself. So parsing boundaries, whether implied, as at Libby with the windows, or clearly demarcated, as at Andersonville, was an inescapable feature of prison life. Because space to sit, space to eat, space to lay down, place to breathe, literally, space to daydream, was so scarce. Almost every prison facility was overcrowded, and many egregiously so. And I'll return to that overcrowding in a moment. But first, I want to emphasize that in every imaginable way, prison pens assaulted the senses. Camp Douglas, for instance, which you'll recall was the camp in Chicago, had deplorable sanitation from the outset. As you may know, Chicago is actually not a good location for a city. I mean, it's fine in the 21st century because of the way we build cities now, but it was actually marshy. So it was built on a pancake flat terrain. And on that pancake flat terrain, there were between 6,000 and 12,000 prisoners who trod, and the prairie soil could not absorb the human and animal waste that accumulated there daily. So within weeks of the camp's opening, the site had already degenerated into a malignant quagmire. Visiting health inspectors recoiled in horror in 1862, and here's how they described it. The amount of standing water, of unpoliced ground, of foul sinks, of unventilated and crowded barracks, of general disorder, of soil reeking with miasmatic accretions, of rotting bones, and the emptyings of camp kettles is enough to drive a sanitarian to despair. And they were, of course, the sanitarians who were driven to despair. Their proposed solution for the camp, this is only weeks after it opened, was to burn it down. So foul was the air in the Richmond warehouse that held William Wilkins, that he had difficulty enduring the nights. Now, he wasn't a military neophyte. He had already fought in the Mexican-American War roughly 2 decades earlier. But nothing in his previous experience prepared him for the stink of prison. I quote him, "Last night I was literally almost suffocated with the noisome vapors that filled the room and had to wrap my head in my blanket in order to breathe." At Andersonville, an overpowering stench, which wafted from, you can't see it here, but you'll see it later. Actually, I do have a picture of it right here. You may have seen this picture in the past. This is one of the most famous pictures of all of Andersonville, again, taken in August of 1864. You may never have known, but this is a latrine. And this is a latrine built over a creek that ran sort of diagonally across the southern end of the camp. And so those men are actually sitting on the latrine when they were photographed. In any case, this was an open-air latrine on the stream that I should point out was also the source of all water for the camp, for more than 30,000 prisoners. So anyone who came within 2 miles of the camp was assailed by the odor, the stench of Andersonville. When South Carolinian Louis Manigault, a descendant of that very prominent Charleston family, witnessed the camp, he plumbed his memory of world travels to come up with any comparison to the scene of Andersonville and the stench. None came to mind, but he did classify it as worse than a Shanghai prison he had seen and worse than a cholera hospital he had seen in China. He said, quote, "The dirt, the filth, the stench in and around the stockade is awful." But then he wasn't moved to any empathy for the prisoners by this grim spectacle he was sensing and seeing. He said, "I feel no pity for them and hold a dead Yankee in a very different light from a dead Confederate." The camps were also a riot of noise. Oops, I'll save him, sorry. They were also a riot of noise. The din of the camps included, of course, the sound of the guards doing whatever they were doing at any given moment. There could be the buzz of civilian life outside, like Libby Prison was in, well, I guess I'll call it the industrial heart of Richmond. So there was street noise immediately outside those windows we saw. There was, of course, the sound of massed prisoners. In Andersonville, you got 35,000 people in roughly 20 acres. They're going to make a lot of noise in and of themselves. And then, of course, too often there was the harrowing sounds of prisoners in agony. Some prisoners found this clamor soothing. It was curiously life-affirming to be surrounded by evidence of life, the tumult of life. But others found it exhausting. Fort Delaware, which is a massive fort on an island just south of Philadelphia, seemed to Robert Bingham, an educator from pre-war North Carolina, and he was then a Confederate officer, to be, quote, "a perfect babel. Noise, noise, noise. I never thought the human voice so discordant before," he grumbled. Some prisoners, but not Robert Bingham, you'll hear more from Robert Bingham, some prisoners gradually became inured to the odor, the stench, and to the cacophony of prisons. But there was no way they could come to terms with the paralyzing overcrowding of the prisons. Week after leaving, Andersonville. And this is a scene that I'll come back to at various times. But this gives you some idea. I realize it's hard for you because of the nature of the image. But this is a sea of people, sea of prisoners. Weeks after leaving Andersonville in 1864, a former prisoner recorded his impressions when he and his comrades had first entered the camp 3 months earlier. Quote, "We found it crowded. By crowded, I mean that it was difficult to move in any direction without jostling or being jostled." Another prisoner groused that there was, quote, "hardly room to lie down." And he wasn't exaggerating. If you divide up the interior space of Andersonville evenly, so that each prisoner could have staked out the same amount of space, each prisoner would have had 18 square feet, or the equivalent of the size of a coffin for his living space. A word portrait of Libby Prison, which was notorious from its overcrowding from its inception in 1862, only hints at the conditions there. The facility actually consisted of 3 different warehouses, 3 separate structures that had been built between 1845 and 1852. And they'd been built for a tobacco factory. They were not ever intended to be used as a prison facility, of course. 3 days after Libby Prison opened in 1862, it held 700 prisoners. By 1864, it held 4,000. Prisoners were held in 8 low-ceilinged rooms that were spread out over 3 floors. There were never less than 1,200 prisoners on any floor, so that each room in Libby Prison held about 400 men. Now, in these circumstances, the fact that none of these rooms had any bunks or any furniture was probably a blessing. An article in the Daily Richmond Enquirer, so this is from a Richmond newspaper, not a Yankee newspaper, in 1864 marveled, quote, "Libby takes in the captured Federals by scores, but lets none out. They are huddled up and jammed in every nook and corner, at the bathing troughs, around the cooking stoves. Everywhere there's a wrangling, jostling crowd." Equally extreme was the overcrowding at Cahaba, a prison located at the confluence of the Alabama, and actually I think it's Cahaba, I said Cahaba, I think it's Cahaba is how you pronounce it. If anybody's here from Alabama, please correct me if I'm getting my pronunciation wrong. It covered roughly, this is a map of the prison, it covered roughly a third of a football field. And it was a rudimentary warehouse that provided shelter for about 500 prisoners. I should say it's a warehouse that didn't have walls on all sides, walls on 2 of the 4 sides. It was designed, as I said, to hold about 500 prisoners. But it was wholly inadequate to hold the 3,000 prisoners who were there by March of 1865. Had prisoners been able to divide up equitably the space at that prison, each would have had 5 square feet. Even where prisoners seemingly enjoyed elbow room, they discovered their access to it was contingent. Go back to Camp Douglas in Chicago. Overcrowding there was markedly less oppressive than it was at the worst Confederate prisons. After exchanges halted in 1863, the prison population rose from 6,000 to about 12,000. They enjoyed enough space when the weather was okay. And there they are, Camp Douglas. So in the summer, it was okay, but those of you who know Chicago know summers are short in Chicago. And in the winter, they had to huddle up in their barracks during what for these Southerners was unprecedented cold. And any action that was deemed insubordination by camp authorities could jeopardize their access to not only the barracks, but to that outside that you see there. So malefactors were sent to the so-called White Oak Dungeon, which was an 18-foot square room. It had 1 small window to provide light, but it provided no relief from the pervasive and nauseating stench in the room. In October 1863, there were 24 prisoners who occupied that room, a room that the prison inspector himself said was suited for 2 or 3 people. One last example, Fort Delaware. Fort Delaware had more than sufficient space for the 20,000 prisoners who were there by the war's end. While enlisted men and junior officers shivered in these drafty, these are all barracks built for the prisoners over here. That's the actual fort to the, I guess, your left. While enlisted men and junior officers were in those damp, cold, drafty, dark barracks, high-ranking officers actually enjoyed what they described as dry, warm, and well-lighted rooms inside the fort. They might have wandered around the very large fort, one of the largest forts in North America at the time. But guards confined them to their rooms, to their overcrowded rooms, so they only left that room to go down to the mess hall. So when prisoners reflected on their experiences in letters, diaries, and post-war memories, they anticipated sociologist Irving Goffman's description of total institutions. In the prison camps like the total institutions that Goffman analyzed during the 1960s, prisoners lived circumscribed. I tried to give you a sense of how circumscribed, scheduled, and surveilled lives. Prisoners conducted almost every activity of their daily lives in shared space. There was no private space in prison. They had little or no control over who they shared that space with, and they had virtually no control over who observed them or when they were observed. Most significant, when we talk about a total institution, prisoners were utterly dependent upon their captors for their survival. Prisoners struggled to find analogies, some way to make sense of this experience, as I've said, and the unfamiliar, disorienting aspects of their lives. Staggering ashore at Camp Lookout, this is Camp Lookout in Maryland. I think I showed a slide earlier of Point Lookout. We'll come back to Camp Lookout various times. Well, stumbling ashore after a 5-day sea journey from Wilmington, North Carolina, to Point Lookout was William Hague, somebody who I'm going to mention multiple times over the next 2 days. William Hague experienced what he described as, quote, the grand entree upon the theater of prison life. For him, the self-contained world of the theater stage provided some sort of metaphor for the experience of entering the camps. He thought of the camps as being a wholly separate world from the real world and normal human relations. Camp inmates, he thought, were like a theatrical troupe in which each prisoner played a role either by choice or by coercion. So he devoted page after page in his letters to sketching out the taxonomy of the characters he encountered in prison. Like an onstage actor subject to constant scrutiny of an audience, Hague felt keenly the inescapable surveillance of the camp sentries. Some prisoners, he noted, displayed outward compliance with the camp dictates. Even while in private, they retained their Confederate convictions. Others, he grumbled, played to the guards, quote, seeking to bask in the sunshine of a Negro Sentinel's smile. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. As Hague's snide remark indicates, Confederate prisoners were certain that the goal of their Union guards was to reduce them to a state below that of black slaves. Both white Northerners and white Southerners looked to the institution of slavery for analogies for their imprisonment. So a Southern prisoner at Fort Lafayette in the New York City harbor invoked the horrors of the Middle Passage when he compared the overcrowding there to, quote, between the decks of a slave ship. As noted previously, Hague fumed at the ignominy of being guarded by black soldiers who apparently took every opportunity to delight in their power over enslavers. And this is actually artwork made during the Civil War by a Confederate at Point Lookout and you can see he made a whole series of watercolors that I will show you some of. And in this one, there's an African-American Union soldier guarding a Confederate prisoner. And you may notice at the bottom, he says, the bottom rail is on the top now. That, for a white Confederate prisoner of war to be guarded by a black soldier, was the ultimate of the degradation that they thought the Union was imposing upon them. In the eyes of many Union prisoners, their ill treatment was an extension of the debased morality of white Southerners, of slaveholders. Samuel Boggs, a Union prisoner, suggested that slave drivers were selected as prison guards so that they could exercise their, quote, barbarous appetites on helpless captives. Captives who, unlike the enslaved, had no economic value. Another prisoner described crowded prisoners in Libby prison forced to cluster, quote, like slaves in the middle passage. Not only were they chained and disciplined like slaves, they were also chased down when they attempted to escape by bloodhounds that were otherwise used to track runaway slaves. Now, historian Ann Fabian has pointed to the sometimes facile comparisons that prisoners, white prisoners, drew between their experiences and the experiences of enslaved African Americans. And I want to stress her point is very well taken. But more was at work than the familiar practice of whites appropriating black experience for their own benefit. Certainly, some memorialists sought to exploit the pathos associated with slavery to render more vivid the prison experience. But a clear logic seemingly justified this comparison. The institution of slavery was the total institution, or the closest thing to a total institution that was familiar to most antebellum Americans. And at least as important was the impulse to expose commonalities in the two total institutions who were inextricably bound up in the war, slavery and the prisoner of war camp. More often, prisoners thought of the prison pens, as self-contained cities. Because of its size, Andersonville indeed possessed the attributes of a city. Admittedly, it was a dystopian landscape. It was equivalent to roughly 10 city blocks. It had emerged with breathtaking speed. It didn't exist in February 1864. And by August of 1864, it has 25,000 people in it. And by later, in September, it had 33,000 people in it. A measure of this frenetic growth can be seen in this scene. Again, this is August 16th, 1864. This is the northeast corner of the camp stockade. There's roughly 10 acres. We can't see all the 10 acres, but that's what's photographed here. This 10 acres was only open to prisoners 7 weeks before the photograph was taken. By middle August, it was jam-packed full of ramshackle lean-tos up to the deadline. And again, here's the deadline. You can see this tent is connected to the deadline. By August of 1864, Andersonville, which didn't exist in February, had overtaken Norfolk, Memphis, Mobile, Savannah, and Nashville, and only trailed New Orleans, Richmond, and Charleston as the largest community in the Confederacy. The extent to which prisoners had any control over this space varied widely. At Andersonville, Confederate authorities imposed virtually no meaningful design on the prisoner space within the stockade. They literally just built the stockade and then put them in. Or actually, they got the prisoners there, made the prisoners build the stockade, and then they put them in. It was the prisoners who fashioned its Broadway, its South Street, and numerous other named and improvised byways. And it may be hard for you to see it, but South Street, South Street is down here. You can see Broadway's up above the creek that's running through where the latrine is. It's sort of the middle. The new area that was settled was up there at that top corner. So in any case, you can see there's a landscape here that prisoners knew. So they created distinct neighborhoods, some of which can be discerned from the photograph and maps. And these neighborhoods were divided by rank, by date of arrival, by ethnicity. So there was a little Irish town, there was an African American cluster over here. and by unit affiliation. Virtually all prisoners devoted what resources they had available to creating and outfitting personal space. To do so was to assert some control over this space that they really didn't control, but they could try to lay control to it. It was to assert some personal agency, and of course it was also to improve the likelihood of survival. At one extreme were the quarters enjoyed by Confederate captured officers at Fort Warren. And that's Fort Warren in the Boston Harbor, which you can visit to the present day if you want to. It was opened up in the first year of the war. Their officers, it was largely officers who were kept there, outfitted surprisingly posh quarters that were unimaginable elsewhere. And let me return to this character who you may recall I mentioned briefly yesterday, but we will revisit him tomorrow as well. Yes, I guess we will hear more about him tomorrow. Well, Colonel Pegram was captured he was the first major Confederate officer captured in July of 1861. He was transferred to Fort Warren, I think it's in October, maybe September of 1861. At Fort Warren, I'll go back there for a second. At Fort Warren, accommodations were handed out on the basis of your rank and social privilege. Well, Pegram was the highest ranking Confederate officer then in Union hands, and he was also an aristocratic Virginian. So he was assigned to a large, well-lighted, and airy room along with 9 other prominent prisoners. They were dissatisfied by the austere decor of their cell, so he and his cellmates purchased rugs, beds, and furnishings from Boston merchants and had them delivered to their cell. They also deemed the rations provided by the prison to be unappetizing. So instead, they contracted with a caterer in Boston to provide them with more Epicurean fare. Wine, brandy, whiskey, and delicacies were sent by family and friends to supplement their catered meals. Within a few weeks of arriving at the fort, one of Pegram's roommates gloated in his diary. So this is in his diary. This wasn't, for any other eyes. Our mess continues to improve. Fare now equal to any of the hotels. Only trouble is I eat too much for so little exercise. In a portion of the cell that they set aside for reading, books, novels, newspaper, and for writing correspondence, Pegram did those activities during the day. In the evening, he and his cellmates feasted on their elaborate dinners, one of which, here's the menu for one: roast turkey, roast and boiled mutton, roast beef, lobster salad, and dessert of nuts of several kinds, fresh peaches in cans, honey, and coffee. End of quote. Then they played backgammon or sang, and a routine evening, according to one of his roommates, concluded with a shared pitcher of hot whiskey punch, which we sip until 11, while Pegram, a teetotaler, gives us some very fine music on the guitar. Accommodations at Camp Lookout, Andersonville, and Belle Isle and Richmond bore no resemblance to those enjoyed by Pegram. At Camp Lookout, we return. William Hague, remember William Hague, who got off the boat from North Carolina, and other Confederate prisoners were assigned to tents organized systematically on a barren 40-acre level stretch of sand along the shore of the Chesapeake Bay. Now, this image doesn't give you a sense. It looks like every single tent's the same. Actually, virtually every form of tent, and there were a lot of different forms of tent, devised during the Civil War was present there, but none of them provided any meaningful protection against the summer heat. And if you know the Chesapeake Bay, the summer heat is oppressive. Winter gales, which are considerable, and very frequent flooding. Worse yet were, of course, the accommodations at Andersonville, where there were none to house prisoners. Prisoners with the wherewithal bought pine branches, literally bought them. They bought cast-off wood to build lean-tos, and that's what you see all over the ground there. They improvised shelters fashioned out of tattered blankets, discarded clothing, random scraps of wood, and any other materials that offer any protection from the elements. Those prisoners who were unable to scrounge up suitable materials resorted to burrowing earthen shebangs in the ground, earthen sort of hovels. Often by comparison to the alternatives, or I should say only by comparison to the alternatives, did these subterranean caves have any merit. 3 months after arriving at Andersonville, Franklin Krause, who was already debilitated by the effects of scurvy, lice, and biting insects, confided in his diary, "It goes pretty hard to have to lie on the hard ground now." The week before this photograph was taken, a torrential downpour had inundated the whole camp, but especially some of these burrows, drowning some of the men who occupied them. Later in the same year, on Christmas Day, there was a deluge that claimed the lives of 2 more men when their dirt cave collapsed. In their search for an accurate equivalent to their plight, Civil War prisoners might have invoked the 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes and his vivid depiction of the state of nature. If you remember that depiction, he describes a world, one of the things about the state of nature is he describes a world with, quote, "no account of time," and bereft of the essential elements of civilization. Well, Hobbes' description certainly captured the paradoxical character of prison time. There was both too much of it and too little of it. In some regards, daily life in the prison camps resembled camp life beyond the stockade walls. Prisoners were rousted out of bed at the crack of dawn. Then they did a roll call, and here's a roll call at Elmira, which is a prison in Elmira, New York, for Confederates. And then daily rations were distributed. The afternoon might be punctuated by another roll call, then by 9 o'clock, prisoners had to be confined in their quarters, whatever they may have been. At Elmira, you can see that barracks. In a place like Andersonville, you're supposed to go back into your hovel. But the Confederates actually didn't bother to monitor Andersonville too much. And all lights were supposed to be extinguished. Contrary to the prevailing laws of war, some prisoners were forced to work on various tasks, and we'll return to this later in the next lecture. But most had no formal responsibilities. There might be squads sent out to get firewood for the entire camp. Prisoners had to prepare their own food, but most of the tasks they were responsible for had to do with their own survival. You might have wondered, well, why didn't they grow their own food? If I can go back, you can look at that landscape. At Andersonville, there was no space to grow food. In fact, at Andersonville, within weeks of the camp opening, all natural vegetation had been foraged for food, firewood, or building materials. So this stockade environment was literally bereft of any living life form, or any life form other than the prisoners themselves. So prisoners were not going to be growing their own food, although every now and then outsiders suggested that they should. For those prisoners who remained healthy enough to track the passage of time, it, quote, dragged heavily. Prisoners like William Felton, a Wisconsin teenager who'd only been a soldier for 6 weeks when he was captured, almost certainly found the inescapable boredom of prison life unnerving. Chester Berry is a figure, we're going to visit with Chester Berry periodically. He was a Union soldier from Michigan who'd spent a year in the ranks before he was captured and sent to Andersonville. So he was painfully aware of the tedium of military life. We all know that military cliche of hurry up and wait. Well, he had that experience. But even grizzled veterans like Berry were demoralized by the stalled time that they endured within the prison camp while life hurtled on outside the camps. Prisoner after prisoner confided in his diary of the soul-numbing monotony of captivity, or as Robert Bingham, who we've already seen once before, actually twice now, described it, this half-lived life. So prisoners resorted to all manner of private and communal activities to try to combat the ennui that they experienced. One of the things you could imagine they did was they devoted a lot of time to maintaining bonds of fraternity in a setting where the vicissitudes of daily life militated against camaraderie. Prisoners who were captured with others from their own unit perpetuated friendships derived from their shared origins or military service. Even solitary and misanthropic captives like Robert Bingham recognized the necessity of finding messmates and bunkmates. Such partnerships became uniquely close often. That was the case of George Clarkson and Corwin Kenny, who shared a blanket at Andersonville. On January 11th, 1865, Kenny roused his friend, complaining of illness. He died within hours, leaving Clarkson desolate. In a terse sentence in his diary, Clarkson memorialized an intimacy with Kenny which is practically familial. Quote, "I shall feel lonesome now, for we slept together for more than 7 months." These prison alliances were crucial for survival. Just had Clarkson and Kenny, prisoner mates shared food, they shared blankets, they shared whatever comforts they might have had. They also nestled together at night to share body heat. When a prisoner fell ill, he relied on his partner to supply the rudimentary care, to fetch water, to fetch food. Clarkson would have done so for Kenny had he not perished so rapidly. In other instances, ill prisoners were substantially more likely to survive when attended by a friend. And we have statistics that actually bear that out. Otherwise, they succumbed unattended, or they ended up in prison hospitals, which no prudent prisoner wanted to do. Prisoners also turned to familiar diversions to promote wider fellowship and to cling to some of the refinements of civilization that they could recreate that might remind them of life beyond the stockade walls. One thing they did was they read voraciously. Reading, of course, we think of as a solitary activity, but as I know you know, in the 19th century, reading was often done collectively. But as well, because reading material was scarce, possessing reading material was an important form of sociability. This is an image of, I realize it's hard for you all to see it in a large enough detail, but I was worried about what it would look like if I expanded it more. This is a famous lithograph of Libby Prison made by a prison artist after he got out of Libby Prison in 1863. And it may be hard for you to see it, but there's an ill man here who's reading a book. There's a man there with a book. There's another man over here. There are people reading all over. And that seems to have been the case. And we can well imagine why. At Johnson's Island, which was a prison for Confederate officers north of Sandusky out in the lake, and at Libby Prison, prisoners established literary societies modeled after the genteel clubs that existed, that had proliferated in the pre-war era. And reflecting the high levels of literacy of the era, they swapped books so that the prisons became essentially circulating libraries. Until worn out by use, books, manuals, newspapers, religious tracts, and any reading material passed hand to hand. Early in the war, especially officers, somebody like John Pegram, you'll remember back at Fort Warren in his posh apartment, he ordered books from booksellers and had them shipped to his prison cell, or he received them from family and friends. He would send them a note, send me this, send me that. But by 1863, such privileges were exceptional. Indeed, prison authorities in both the Confederacy and the Union began limiting access to newspapers and mails. And so what was in the prisons tended to be all that remained in the prisons until new prisoners arrived and brought in new reading material. Prisoners resisted the degradation of camp life also by adorning themselves and their surroundings with objets d'art that they fashioned. Some produced crafts, others art. Now, most of them had been stripped of their possessions when they were captured, so they had to be resourceful. Artistically inclined prisoners improvised watercolors, inks, and tools, and they would embellish letters that they sent home with their drawings, or they would make rustic paintings on discarded pieces of paper. And these are various examples from where you can see I've listed them. So if you go top, the first one is Vanderwide. He was in Danville. The next one is of the Kern, which is of Johnson's Island in Ohio. That one's Sneeden of Fort Lawton in Georgia. And that's the character we saw from Almenhauser, who was at Camp Lookout. And this last one is W. Newman, who was, I'm trying to remember where he was. In any case, these are just examples of the artwork that they created. And it's the only visual record we have of prison life that was not mediated by the captors. Meanwhile, prison yard artisans used any scrap they could find to fashion chairs, plates, decorations, things to enrich their lives. They weren't capable of producing the kind of artistry that previous generations of prisoners of war, like those French prisoners of war during the Napoleonic War that I mentioned earlier this morning. But these are an example of the carvings they made out of pieces of bone, out of stones that they found, out of whatever they could use. They made chessmen, rings, studs, sleeve buttons, which one prisoner described as of a very fine style. They made music. The communal celebratory character of music making was obviously a balm for prisoners, provided some sort of consolation, provided some sense of community. A prisoner at Camp Douglas in Chicago, for example, was heartened that, quote, some nights they will get an old violin and fiddle and dance until the lights go out. The most remarkable example is perhaps this production. I realize you can't read that, but this is the only, I've never seen this in person, I've only seen this online. This is the program from a production that was staged in Libby Prison in 1863 of a minstrel show. Despite the constraints imposed by captivity, prisoners managed to wheedle, quote, apparel from for the performers who took the ladies' parts, and materials for costumes, stage curtains, and other purposes from prison guards and officials. Performers bought instruments from outside the prison, and they even printed up this program. The event attracted Confederate prison officials who, quote, took an interest, at least one of whom was impressed, quote, evening entertainment by bogus darkies, good, he reported. And that speaks to, of course, the irony of we have white Union prisoners of war in a prisoner of war prison in Richmond, Virginia, producing a minstrel show in blackface. Music making also provided an oral, A-U-R-A-L, means of protest and resistance that couldn't easily be suppressed. So at this same Libby prison, prisoners periodically sang the Star-Spangled Banner, hang Jeff Davis on an old sour apple tree, John Brown's Body, that really must have gotten him going, and other patriotic tunes. And as I mentioned, those windows are open, so they're singing to the streets of Richmond. Although irked by the singing, the guards had no easy way to suppress it. As prisoner William Wilkins put it, without gagging every man. There were, of course, other pastimes. One of the most famous images to come out of the Civil War, some of you have seen, is undoubtedly this image of baseball being played at Salisbury Prison in North Carolina. Baseball was played there almost every day during the summer of 1862, when weather permitted. There was also, Confederates played baseball at Johnson's Island Prison. We have a description of it in June of 1864 of two Southern baseball teams, one called the Southern and one called the Confederate Club. The Southerners beat the Confederates, I think it was 19-11. One of the Confederates who marveled, who saw it, was Daniel Hunley, who's famous for other reasons I won't go into right now. He's the author of Social Relations in Our Southern States. before the war. And in any case, he marveled that during the game, all the prisoners looked on with eager interest, while the Union soldiers outside the prison yard evidenced as much interest as did the rebels themselves. So in these myriad ways, from impromptu literary debates to sporting events, prisoners labored earnestly to avoid a kind of brutish, solitary life, shorn of the finer things. In other words, they fought back against the total institution in which they were enmeshed. But we shouldn't exaggerate their ability to do so. It's an incredibly harsh environment they were in. They ended up squabbling with each other for all the reasons we could well imagine. They squabbled over space, bedding, when there was any, who would tend to a sick friend, all of those things. So maintaining civility amid the press of the crowds in the camps was a challenge. And of course, these are men that brought with them into the camps prejudices. Prejudices about ethnicity, class, and etiquette. Ever dyspeptic, Robert Bingham, who I've shown many times, he was appalled by the boorishness of the men around him, his fellow Confederates. He complained bitterly about having to live with these people. Similarly, William Hague, who I've mentioned, he was a proud patrician. So he complained about the unwashed with whom he was forced to live at Camp Lookout. And then go back to this image. Remember, we saw this and I used it as an example to talk about reading. There are two gentlemen right here. We'll revisit one of them tomorrow. But this guy is a guy named Orlando B. Wilcox. He was a Union officer from Michigan. He's standing there beside Michael Corcoran, a prominent Irish nationalist and Union officer from New York City. They look like bosom buddies there. Wilcox ridiculed Corcoran in letters to his wife as, quote, the Irish lion and as near an ass as can be. He labeled Corcoran's Irish coterie among the prisoners as blackguards, who harbored, he said, an unwarranted hostility against me. So any sentiments of fraternity had to withstand the circumstances within, the prejudices I've just mentioned. And then there was the inexorable impoverishment that went on. Because the prisons were closed, prisoners had few access, they had virtually no access to the things that they would have wanted. We'll talk about base necessities as well as any creature comforts. So the main ways to supplement their measly existence was to get occasional postal packages from their family. Those were allowed by both sides until by the spring and summer of 1864, the prison officials either stopped those or else they became impractical for the most part. So by 1864, you had to rely on camp sutlers. Sutlers were these kind of merchants. I'll talk about them again. That's a camp sutler for a Union camp outside. There was actually even a sutler in Andersonville. You can see there's one but you obviously needed to have money. And so a labor market of sorts developed in the camp, with prisoners exploiting any skill they possessed to try to improve their circumstances. So for example, there was one enterprising Andersonville prisoner who traded haircuts for daily rations. Decades later, a prisoner who had had his hair cut by him would identify where he was in that crowd. That is the barber. You might wonder at the extravagance of prisoners who suffer from malnutrition, trading rations for haircuts. Well, there's a very practical motivation for doing so. Having trimmed hair and beards made the hunt for lice that much easier. And it was a daily hunt for lice. In a caste-deprived setting like this, gambling provided some prisoners with a strategy to secure necessities without having to rob people or to resort to violence. Most prisoner diarists, of course, remarked grimly, or I should say primly, by lamenting gambling. Presumably they were writing those diaries assuming that somebody else might read them. But there's one, George Albee, and here's actually the cover of his diary. This was the exception. He calculated the benefits of gambling on poker in his diary, and he concluded, quote, I will be no worse off, and I may win enough to buy a loaf or two of bread. That Albee would risk so much in order to buy a loaf of bread was a testament to the desperate hunger that stalked men in the camps. Even more than complaints about boredom and overcrowding, grievances about food pervaded the letters, diaries, and memoirs of prisoners. In the eyes of prisoners, prison rations were one of the most conspicuous manifestations of both their systematic dehumanization and their captors' callousness. And I could go on and on and on, but recognizing what time it is about, and some of you may well be hungry, I'm not going to linger too long on this, except to say that even while prisoners complained bitterly about prison fare, and I won't give you grotesque descriptions of what they ate, they bolted down whatever they received because they had no alternative. Luther Billings recalled prisoners devouring their rations as quickly as possible to thwart others from stealing them, and of officers, quote, fighting like dogs over a dirty bone or a crust of bread. Another prisoner compared mealtime to, quote, feeding a drove of swine. These commonplace analogies to scavenging, these commonplace analogies to animals, to scavenging dogs and rooting hogs, bespoke the prisoners' awareness that their diets and eating habits, over which they had little control, were reducing them to an animalistic, uncivilized state. The ceaseless craving for food triggered organized depredation at some camps. Many prisoners, as I've said, were systematically stripped of everything they had, anything valuable that they had when they were captured. And anything that was left was then stolen by prison guards. Thereafter, if there was anything left, and sometimes they found ways to secrete things and get through all of those various steps of being robbed, prisoners managed to retain something that marauders in the camps would seek. Any possessions left unattended would be pilfered. At night, vigilant prisoners had to keep anything that they considered valuable close at hand, literally against their body, because otherwise predatory campmates would cut a hole in a tent, would reach through the lean-to and steal anything that was unsecured. And then there were criminal gangs, the most notorious of which were the Raiders at Andersonville, a group of between 50 and 100 prisoners who were well organized, armed with clubs and knives that they got somehow or another. And they located themselves at the south gate that new prisoners came through. And when new prisoners came through, anything that was left was taken by the Raiders. The Raiders lived better than anyone else in the camps because they stole what they needed. So they built an elaborate tent that could house 100 out of stolen materials. They ate better than anyone else in the prison. And of course, they were flush with money that they had stolen. Eventually, their transgressions aroused so much ire among their fellow prisoners that with the tacit approval of Confederate authorities, they resorted to vigilantism, rounded up dozens of members, held an impromptu trial within the stockade, and hanged 6 of the gang members in July 11th of 1864, about a month before the pictures were taken that we've seen. One of the condemned, Patrick Delaney, defended his lawlessness, proclaiming from the gallows, quote, he would rather be hanged than to live here in Andersonville. There were, in addition to the grind of living in an environment where this violence overhung life, there was, of course, the disappointment that came from prisoners awaiting exchanges after 1863 that never happened. So time and time there would be rumors of exchanges and they wouldn't happen. The emotional and physical strain that I'm describing here eventually translated into a crippling combination of melancholy, despair, and lethargy for many soldiers. Keep in mind, the Civil War generation had no clinical definition, no clinical description of depression, but they certainly witnessed it in the prison camps. You can even see it in the photographs of Andersonville. I didn't pick one out. I should have picked a different one out here. But in some of the photographs, you can see men who have no pants, men who are lying in a fetal position on the ground, tottering about, ill-clad, or some tottering about ill-clad. Camp administrators unknowingly described depression when they excoriated prisoners who allegedly were too lazy to attend to their personal hygiene. At Andersonville, a dismayed camp inspector reported that prisoners deposited, quote, deposited feces everywhere, even among their very shelters and under their noses. Well, part of this was because they were too tired, too ill, too sick, and in some cases just filled with this melancholy to care. Observers recounted how prisoners were reduced to idiocy by uncontrollable cravings, especially for food. After tending to recently released prisoners, humanitarian Dorothea Dix described cadaverous men, quote, talking like children in their desires for food and begging to gaze at food when they were prevented from eating it. One character, who we'll revisit tomorrow, Charles Carroll Gray, was a Union officer and surgeon, who was captured at the First Battle of Bull Run and then migrated all over. He eventually was in 6 different prisons before he was released in late 1862. Because he was a doctor and he was worn down by this peripatetic experience he had of migrating from prison to prison, and recognizing that his mental health was deteriorating, he resorted to self-medication, and he began taking opium. As a doctor, he had access to opium. We often don't think about this, but the most widely prescribed medicine during the Civil War was probably opium. Union doctors prescribed or issued more than 10 million opium pills and nearly 3 million ounces of opium powders and tinctures. The reason why Gray would have done this was because opiates suppressed diarrhea and coughing, as well as producing a state of temporary euphoria. In his diary, he records periodically taking the opium. Had he not been released in August of 1862, he almost certainly would have had to stop anyways. Was because by 1863, medicines were virtually unavailable, unattainable in Confederate camps, let alone outside in the larger Confederacy. But most other prisoners lacked any remedy like opium pills to escape from the ordeals of camp life. You may wonder about self-harm. And there were certainly numbers of prisoners who pondered whether death was preferable to life in the camp, like Patrick Delaney, who I mentioned. William Hague, who I've quoted several times, acknowledged in a letter to his sister that, quote, I don't believe that I've ever premeditated suicide before, but if such a thought be pardonable, it would be under the circumstances I found myself in. Subsequently, he wrote wistfully to his sister about the miracle of death, as he called it, that enabled some of his fellow prisoners to escape Camp Lookout. Few prisoners, however, apparently translated their longings for escape into suicide. To do so required an uncommon combination of desperation and ingenuity, because prisoners didn't have access to the common methods of self-destruction. 4 months after enlisting, Robert Shalito, a 29-year-old from Pennsylvania, fashioned one end of his suspenders to the roof of a cobbled-together hut, made a slip knot with the other end, and hanged himself in the dark beside his sleeping Andersonville tent mates. He was interred in grave number 6,776 in the cemetery. Another demoralized Andersonville prisoner successfully courted death by crossing the deadline boundary, and taunting sentries until they shot him down. In the interest of time, I'm not going to talk about illness in the hospital at Andersonville. I've probably worn you down enough by this point. But I do want to end. The last thing I want to talk about is the experience of death in the camps. because, let me get back to where I want to be here to make sure I make this point. Death marked the conclusion of this drawn-out process of coerced dehumanization, but it was also the exit for approximately 26,000 Confederate prisoners and more than 30,000 Union prisoners from the prison confines. As I'm sure you know, 19th century Americans ascribed transcendent importance to death, and they aspired to die in accordance with elaborate norms that they called the good death. A good death was consonant with a life well lived. But obviously, during the Civil War, large numbers of men did not die a good death amid the carnage of the battlefield or the commotion of a field hospital. But the plight of prisoners of war was even worse. Their deaths were not elevated by battlefield heroics, dying of dysentery, dying of malnutrition, dying of cholera. Those are not elevated deaths. Nor were they accompanied by the bedside gathering of their kin. Even while William Hague, who I keep mentioning, blessed the miracle of death, he lamented, quote, that there was no friend to stand by their grave or to know their resting place. Not even is their death known to the men in the camp. These were deaths that were a mockery of life's value. But conditions were even worse at Andersonville. There, as you'll recall, I showed a photograph. Corpses, 20 or 30 at a time, were loaded into an open wagon, transported to the graveyard where they were buried with no mourners present, no religious rites, without any conventional funeral trappings. The overcrowding that characterized the camp extended to the afterlife. The dead were crowded into mass graves with rustic headboards, identifying their approximate location. And the only way that we know their names, for the most part, this is where I skipped all of these horrible stories I would have told you about hospitals. But the only way that we know the names of the people buried at Andersonville is because this gentleman, Dorrance Atwater, who was a teenager, Union soldier captured at Gettysburg, was assigned to serve as a clerk in the prison headquarters. And he surreptitiously compiled a list of the names of the deceased. Eventually, that list would be 13,714 names long. But if we didn't have his list, the 921 unknown graves that still exist at Andersonville would almost certainly be would be joined by many, many more. Well, let me close here. I know it's time for me to close. Let me return to William Hague. William Hague, like the majority of Civil War prisoners, actually survived the ordeal of the prison pen. But he didn't leave the confines of Camp Lookout until July 1865, 2 months after the fall of the Confederacy. It took a while for the Union to get them all back down south. So on the threshold of freedom, he wrote a letter to his sister in which he speculated about how the prison experience might have shaped his character and outlook. Fascinatingly, he invoked the ordeals of Jean Valjean, the tortured protagonist of Victor Hugo's recently published Les Miserables, which he had somehow read in prison. After having served, as you may know, after having served a harsh prison sentence for stealing bread to feed his sister's famished children, Valjean has struggled to lead a normal life. Well, Hague perceived a kindred spirit in Valjean, and he wondered whether he still had the capacity to, quote, embrace goodwill, gentleness, and peace. Or would he, like Valjean, have done during his imprisonment, succumb to hate, quote, hate and anger against men? Well, Hague's anxieties were justified. The legacy of the mass suffering in the camps lingered long after the war's end. Research on the post-war lives of Union prisoners of war, for example, reveals that the children of prisoners of war and the grandchildren of prisoners of war have measurable, statistically significant higher rates of health and mental health disorders than the general population. So the search for the larger meaning of life in the prisons fell almost exclusively to Hague and the other camp survivors. In articles, memoirs, speeches in the years after the war, both Confederate and Union memorialists began cataloging the ordeals and sufferings they had endured. The memory of the camp experience produced the bitterest sectional recriminations of the post-war era. They posed the biggest hurdle to national reconciliation. But because the contest of memory of the camps was couched almost exclusively in stark oppositional terms, our camps were humane and their camps were inhumane. Both sides said that. It generated much less, or I should say much heat, but little light. Over and over, former prisoners traced their suffering to the malignant personalities of specific captors. Only rarely, in the broadest and vaguest ways, did they assign any broader responsibility to the values and the culture of their captors, or of their own side. Few, if any, reflected on the shared role of Southerners and Northerners together in pioneering the modern prison camp. Thank you. So, having enlivened your evening, I'm game to take questions.
From where did you get most of your sources, like the documents and the letters?
Can you repeat that?
Yes, from where did I get the sources? Great question. There's how would I put this? One of the great luxuries of anyone who delves into the Civil War, and I am experiencing this luxury for the first time, I have not previously done work on the Civil War per se, is that even the most obscure person, I don't mean that in any pejorative way, after the Civil War knew that they lived through something important. And so even incredibly obscure people saved letters that they may have written. And we have letters from the Civil War that are written by, to call them literate is generous, but they scratched something out and sent it through the mail and somebody preserved it. So I use letters from prisoners of war that were sent, like William Hague sent letters, a few letters during his time at Point Lookout, but especially in the period of time between between April 1865 and July when he finally got home. In that 2-month period of time, you can see, or I should say, it seems as though he was just sitting down reflecting while he rotted in prison. He was like, what has this meant? What has this done to me? So prisoners of war's letters from prisoners of war to their families, diaries. Sometimes their diaries are preserved. They obviously, if they died, they gave the diary to somebody else who maintained it, or else sometimes their effects earlier in the war were sent home. So we have a surprising number of prison diaries. And then there's a vast library. I don't know the exact number, but I know of at least 200 prison memoirs. And then we have, for the Union side, we have vast documentation of the Union Army's prison system. The Confederacy, as I'm sure you can imagine if you don't know, the Confederates destroyed an awful lot of their documents. And they especially made a point, they purposely destroyed the documents relating to their prisons. So we have much less on the actual operation of Confederate prisons. But the bottom line is we have a wealth of material, surprisingly enough. Other questions?
This morning's lecture, you mentioned that there are hundreds of memoirs that were published by prisoners and their experiences. How do you go about compiling all that to potentially get a synthesis of what the experience was from all those sources?
Great question. So, in case you couldn't hear it, the question was, let me get back closer to the microphone. The question was, given that there are hundreds of memoirs written, how do I somehow sort of synthesize them? How do I weave those together into something coherent, something to synthesize it together? Is that fair as a crude summary, paraphrasing? That's an excellent question, and I have thought, I haven't done it yet, but I'm actually thinking of, I have more than 100 of those, probably about 150 in digitized form, thankfully. So many of them have been digitized. And so I was actually thinking of doing some working quantitatively with some of doing word counts and actually trying to use some of the, well, I'll call it bibliographic literary tools that are available to chart some of the narrative tropes as well as some of the actual tropes in the memoirs themselves. But more broadly speaking, the memoirs typically, there are one of two ways that they're structured. Usually they are either narratives from them when they're captured to when they're freed, or else they may be organized sort of thematically. So it's as though the prisoners themselves have given a certain order to them. In my own case, I have just tried to delve into them and tried to use the memoirs less for what I might call factual detail, because it is clear some of the memoirs are post-war constructions and some of the details are just inaccurate. Some of the details, for all I know, might be made up. So what I tend to especially pay attention to in the memoirs are the descriptions where the author is trying to evoke his or her, well, it's his mental state and what he felt. Because I'm hopeful that those descriptions are, while they are shaped by the process of memory, that they are less, shall we say, dependent on facts that the author may or may not have had command of when he was writing the memoir. Does that help? Make sense? Other questions? Boy, I've left you all depressed.
You talked about the Raiders, the conflict there in the Andersonville, but you also talked about there being kind of different ethnic groups. Wondering what the relationship there was. There a lot of ethnic conflict in Andersonville?
That's a great question and something I haven't seen developed at any great length. I will tell you that the Raiders have the 6 men who were executed informally by the vigilantes in Andersonville, all were Irish American. Now, there are a lot of different ways to read that. Some of the prisoners explain that, some of the later prisoners reflecting back on it, that the Raiders had their origins in Irish American New York gangs. So they came into the camps with a kind of culture of predation. That may entirely be true. We know New York City had Irish gangs, so that could be true, but that could also be, of course, a reflection of Protestant, white, Irish American animosity. Within the camps, something I will talk a little bit more about tomorrow, there were at Andersonville several hundred African American prisoners of war. They clustered together in a particular part of the camp. They don't seem to have been victims of any particular ill treatment, but one could, there'll be reasons I'll suggest tomorrow as to why they would understandably cluster together the way they did. So I think it's hard to really answer that question because most people, it's rare to have a prisoner of war who really reflects thoughtfully about the community around him, and so much of their rage is focused on the Confederates and what the Confederates are or are not doing. The exception are officers, because they tend to be more privileged in so many different ways. And there were some officers at Andersonville, but largely Andersonville was, many of the officers for whom we have diaries and letters, et cetera, were at Libby Prison, which was mainly officers, or Johnson's Island, which was exclusively Confederate officers, for example. And they tend to be more like they tend to be more attentive to class distinctions, ethnic divisions, what have you. So I don't really have a great answer for it, but you can see evidence that it's present. There are also, I think, some hints of German Anglo-American divisions in the camps as well. Other questions? So after that heartwarming lecture, you're going to be keen to come back tomorrow for more. I promise you tomorrow will have a different tone. Not, again, it's not uplifting, but it's not quite as grim as tonight. And you should thank me. I left out all my descriptions of prison fare or of the prison hospitals. So it could have been worse. But I will send you out that image which I showed earlier this morning. And I actually have this photograph reproduced. And this may speak to my very grim nature. But I have this picture reproduced, and it hangs right beside my desk. Well, the reason why is every day when I'm writing, I want to look at that picture. And this man is holding Leander Furnham. He actually has his leg. And I want to remind myself, that's a human being who's being dumped in a mass grave. And I want to do justice to that man. And to the experience that he, and these other, just think, I mean, as horrible as his experience was, these men are burying 100 men a day. Not one day, not 2 days, but for months on end. What was it like to do that every day? And that's, I mean, I realize it may seem incredibly grim, but that's a story that just speaks to me. So on that heartwarming note, thank you again, and I'll look forward to seeing some of you tomorrow.